now. Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I would like to warmly welcome everyone to the webinar on human rights in Cambodia 30 years after the Paris Peace Agreement on the 9th December 2021. This webinar is co-organized by DTP or Diplomacy Training Program, Asian Democracy Network, and Forum Asia to commemorate the International Day for the Prevention of Genocide. Today is also marked the 30th anniversary of the historic Paris Peace Agreement. My name is Yuyun Wahyungingrum. I'm the representative of Indonesia to the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, and I'm going to be your moderator for this webinar. Distinguished participants, 30 years ago in 1991, following the genocide of the Pol Pot regime, Australia's then Foreign Minister, the Honorable Gareth played a critical role in bringing peace to Cambodia. The Paris Peace Agreement, developed through painstaking regional diplomacy and the United Nations, promised peace and democracy to Cambodians. 30 years later, today, concerns over human rights and democracy in Cambodia are growing, with democratic political opposition marginalized and domestic movements for human rights facing increasing repression. The international community is challenged to fulfill its responsibilities to the peoples in Cambodia. The repression of civil society and the rise increasingly authoritarian government is one of the greatest challenges to human rights and peace in the region. As Cambodia assumed the leadership of ASEAN by January 1st, 2022, Cambodia holds new responsibilities to lead ASEAN's responses to the human rights and humanitarian crisis in Myanmar. Speakers in this webinar are invited to reflect on growing importance of civil society as defender of international human rights standards and the need to protect and promote civil society space and cooperation in solidarity with those in Cambodia, Myanmar, and other countries where peaceful advocacy is becoming so dangerous. Speakers may also reflect on the role of ASEAN and the international community and how global civil society movement and Cambodia diaspora can support democracy and human rights in Cambodia and ASEAN today. We are honored by the presence of our speakers today, the Honorable Gareth, Ms. Sopie Chak, Executive Director, Cambodian Center for Human Rights, Mr. Karel Jiaan Antonio Galang, Program Officer from the ASEAN Democracy Network, or ADN. We have in total 90 minutes. It is divided into 35 minutes for presentation, which its speaker will be speaking and sharing their thoughts in 15 minutes. And we are going to have another 45 minutes for question and answer. We welcome questions from the participants. You can use the facility provided by the Zoom, which raise hand facility. You can also type your questions in Q&A box, and I will read them for the panelists. Now, without further ado, I would like to start with our webinar, and I'm delighted to invite Honorable Gareth to the screen, and you have 15 minutes, sir, please.
Well, thank you so much, Yuyun, and it's a great pleasure to join you all on this important commemorative event. It really is hard to overemphasize the importance of the Paris Peace Agreement signed 30 years ago on the 23rd of October, 1991. For years before, as we all know, Cambodia had been on its knees, ravaged successively by massive US bombing during the Vietnam War, by civil war, by the Khmer Rouge's reign of terror, by invasion by the Vietnamese, then by civil war again. These onslaughts, and above all the horrific Khmer Rouge genocide, caused the death of some 2 million Cambodians and effectively destroyed the lives of a great many more. The 1991 Paris Accords did bring lasting peace to the country. And I hope that the many international participants in this webinar will forgive me saying that Australia can remain proud of the role that we played in making that happen. Working very closely with my Indonesian friend and colleague, Ali Alatas, we initiated the diplomatic strategy that, after many previous failed attempts, finally worked. That strategy was set out in detail in the so-called Red Book, still widely remembered by Cambodians, which we prepared for the crucial Jakarta informal meeting of February 1990. Strategy worked essentially by designing an unprecedentedly hands-on role for the United Nations, which gave China a face-saving way of withdrawing its support for the Khmer Rouge. Australians, I think, can also remain very proud of General John Sanderson's leadership of the UNTAC military mission during the critical 1991 to 93 transition period, which was really crucial to the success of the whole peace enterprise. But as I said, when representing Australia as our foreign minister at the Paris signing ceremony in 1991, peace and freedom are not prizes which once gained can never be lost. They must be won again each day. Their foundations must be sunk deep into the bedrock of political stability, economic prosperity, and above all, the observance of human rights. Excuse me. Sadly, the truth of that observation has been borne out repeatedly, as Yuyun has said already, over the last 3 decades. We brought peace to Cambodia and with it some overdue national economic development. But as to democracy and human rights, the other 2 core elements of the Paris agreements, the record really has been one of dismal failure. Excuse me. The rot set in early. The 1993 election was a brilliant success. With 90% turnout, it was an incredibly moving experience to watch those voters in family groups, everyone from grannies to new babies, lined up for hours at polling stations across the country, knowing the high risk of bomb attacks, but with so much joyful confidence in the future. But it didn't result, that election, in the expected win for Hun Sen and his governing Cambodian People's Party. Hun Sen refused to accept the result, and the international community, I think far too meekly in retrospect, allowed him to become joint prime minister. It was the last fully free and fair election that Cambodia was to hold. Hun Sen has been clever and utterly ruthless. Within a short time, he'd vanquished his opponents, taken steps to ensure that no opposition party could meaningfully contest his leadership. And over the years that have passed, the CPP, his party, has become synonymous with corruption, with land evictions, with control of judiciary and army, of course, political repression, wide-scale arrests and imprisonment, physical threats to those protesting the loss of human rights, and on occasion, outright murder. As I called it out in an internationally syndicated article I wrote back in 2014, which understandably enough enraged my former negotiating partner, Hun Sen. Over 30 years, moreover, Hun Sen has amassed vast fortunes for his family, including by siphoning off millions of dollars in aid contributed by the West. All this while almost 30% of Cambodians live barely above the poverty line, and a great many more survive on no more than around $3 a day, with COVID-19, of course, adding immensely to economic as well as social distress. The World Bank ranks Cambodia's control of corruption as in the lowest 10% in the world. From time to time, hopes have been raised that maybe things were changing. In 2012, a wave of serious organised opposition began to develop, and the main opposition party, the Cambodian National Rescue Party, the CNRP, almost won the 2013 election. But this was not an opportunity that Hun Sen would allow to be repeated. Repression intensified on multiple fronts, and with the 2018 general election looming, in late 2017, the year before, Hun Sen arrested the opposition CNRP leader, Kem Sokha, charged him with treason, disbanded the party altogether. Thousands fled overseas. There are no fig leaves left. Cambodia cannot now be described as anything other than a dictatorship. So what can be done now? When it comes to the various relevant international organizations, I'm afraid my hopes are not high. ASEAN remains hugely important for its role in maintaining peace among its historically very quarrelsome members, and as an organization for economic and technical cooperation, yes. But it's found it very difficult to maintain any kind of discipline over its members when it comes to internal democracy and human rights issues, with Myanmar just the most recent example. And with Cambodia itself now becoming chair of ASEAN in 2022, the prospects of ASEAN placing any collective pressure on Phnom Penh seems even more fanciful. Maybe our moderator today, Yuyun, as Indonesia's representative on the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, can persuade us all that my pessimism is misplaced. I live in hope that that's the case. As to United Nations mechanisms, it's been hard to energize the Human Rights Council in Geneva to take any kind of effective action, despite the efforts of successive UN rapporteurs on human rights in Cambodia, appointed pursuant to the Paris Peace Agreements, and starting with Australia's own Michael Kirby, who we're very sorry has been unable through illness to join us today. And it remains even harder to engage the rather more powerful United Nations Security Council. Partly that's been a product of the protection routinely given to Hun Sen's government by China, by far Cambodia's biggest investor and creditor. Beijing treats it for all practical purposes as a wholly owned subsidiary, relying on Cambodia's support to undermine ASEAN unanimity on issues important to China, like the South China Sea. I know there continues to be support among Cambodian activists for the reconvening of the Paris International Conference on Cambodia, as indeed provided for in the 1991 agreements. But the trouble is there's no evident support for this from any of the permanent 5 Security Council members or other key participants, all of whom have multiple other current distractions. And I think we have to face the reality that the strongest steps the conference could take, if it did meet again, would simply be to refer human rights concerns to, as the agreement says, the competent organs of the United Nations, back, in other words, to the essentially impotent Human Rights Council. I believe the greatest hope for Cambodia's future lies with its own people, backed up with support and pressure, not so much from multilateral organizations, but individual countries genuinely committed to human rights and democracy, and who are capable of exercising some influence. Cambodia's people, both at home and abroad, have shown extraordinary courage and resilience in the face of adversity. And whenever they've had the chance, that they want above all the restoration of decent governance. With a median age of, I think, 25, Cambodia's population, the youngest of any Southeast Asian country, Cambodia has wonderful potential, and younger generation leaders have continued to struggle against almost impossible odds to keep the flames of justice alight. Among the country's many brave human rights defenders, the founders of the first organizations in the early 1990s, and those who have carried on the struggle since, among them is Chak, Sopie, head of the Cambodian Center for Human Rights, who I'm absolutely delighted to be sharing this platform with today. Sopheap's story, and that of a dozen others, is in fact superbly told in Sue Coffey's book, Seeking Justice in Cambodia, published by Melbourne University Press back in 2018. It's really important that this story continues to be told and that its message of hope gets through to the next generation. Beyond their own resources and commitment, what I think the Cambodian people really need is external support, not just in the form of sympathetic resolutions from multilateral forums, but hard, practical measures from individual countries that can put real pressure on Hun Sen and those around him to modify their behaviour. This means, in particular, in the context of the next scheduled general election in 2023, pressure to reverse the ban on the main opposition party and to enable the genuine exercise of universal civil and political rights across the whole community. Targeted individual sanctions against key regime members and their families, basically asset freezes and other financial restrictions, visa bans, are the most useful forms of such pressure. The Australian government, after dragging its feet for years, has at last, just this month, secured the passage through Parliament of a so-called Magnitsky Act to make easier the application of such sanctions in human rights cases, following US, UK and Canadian legislation so named to honour the Russian dissident Magnitsky, who was tortured and killed after exposing government corruption in Russia. It may be a triumph of hope over experience to believe that this new legislation will be applied with any vigour by our current Australian government, but the Hun Sen government should certainly be one of its first targets. Australia has been a world leader in the past in supporting the Cambodian people in their yearning for life and for liberty. With their basic rights and freedoms now more imperiled than they have been since the end of the Khmer Rouge genocide, it really is time for our voice to be once again strongly heard. And it's time for the voices of many other countries to be heard as well. But at the end of the day, it is the voice of the Cambodian people, both at home and abroad, that will matter most. As I said in another forum 3 years ago at the World Khmer Conference, everything I know about the pride and courage and resilience of the Cambodian people tells me that the overwhelming majority clearly want the restoration of decency and dignity in the way that they're governed, so that Cambodia will in fact at last become the country we all wanted it to be when we finally put to rest the ravages of genocide and civil war. Well, I have enormous confidence that with the continuing commitment of so many Cambodians, including those participating in this event, there will prevail that will for decency and dignity, for genuine democracy and genuine respect for human rights. Thank you, and I look forward to participating in the discussion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Evans. Thank you for the positive notes. It was very impressive, compelling and strong speech. I'm listening to you. I feel so blessed and privileged to hear to learn about Paris Agreement from one of the main actors in the past. Now we move to the second speaker, Ms. Sopie Chak, the Executive Director of Cambodian Center for Human Rights. So we are going to listen from the civil society inside Cambodia to share the insights. So Sopie.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you so much, and good morning to our panelists and as well as our audience who joined us today. Indeed, today is a very special occasion. It's not only the the day to prevent the atrocity or genocide, but also it is the International Day of Human Rights Defender Day, Anti-Corruption Day indeed, and also tomorrow for Human Rights Day. So I appreciate to Diplomacy Training Program for having arranged this topic and to reflect as well with the Paris Peace Agreement, and my great respect to Professor Gareth, for your enormous support to Cambodia 30 years ago, or maybe before 30 years ago, not just during the Paris Peace Agreement, but mainly during the Paris Peace Agreement formulation. You and together with other signatories have devoted a lot of effort. I could not imagine how hard the process has been, because when I read the document, it's very comprehensive. And each time I read that, I feel, oh my God, the signatory have really, invest a lot of energy, but also the vision for the future of Cambodia. And if we have been walking through this path, perhaps, we can really achieve the full peace. So now, 3 decades ago, Cambodia have signed the Paris Peace Agreement, and we put the years of atrocity and turmoil behind, and starting the transition from conflict ravaged country to an island of peace. The island of peace somehow have been quoted in our constitution as well. The agreement marked the end of a century of Cambodia marred by the colonial rules, the barbaric authoritarianism, and a brutal genocide and foreign occupation, as well as the internal turmoil. The signature of the agreement, which sought to not only end the conflict, but also give Cambodia independence and ensure Cambodia right to self-determination, as well as, envision for the significant achievement of the peace, full peace. But on the occasion of 30th anniversary of Paris Peace Agreement, we saw question whether the version of peaceful and democratic Cambodia have truly been achieved. Professor Gareth have highlighted a lot the challenge, and indeed, I totally agree with his observation. And however, despite some violation of the agreement being deplored in the years following the signatory, we could see that somehow Cambodia have achieved, I would call it a negative peace, with the end of conflict, the end of the war. We can see now there's no armed guerrilla anymore, like in the early in the late 80s or early 90s, but with this remarkable success, the challenge for Cambodia is the democracy and human rights respect. Perhaps the most egregious example of Cambodia deviation from the path laid down by the agreement have been the dissolution of the CNOP, by the Supreme Court in the late 2017, and Cambodia then become the de facto of one-party state. Following that year, a number of key actors of democracy have been massively attacked, not only the opposition party, but the media, the human rights defender, NGO, like the case of NDI that have been chased out from the country in the context of the implementation of the Lango, the Law and Association and NGO law, as well as, even with the dissolution of CNOP, we could see the opposition member have been still intimidated up to this point. There have been a massive sermon against the former CNOP member, massive trial, within this week, we can see the hearing now resume with the case against them, as well as with Saint Thierry, the Cambodian American lawyer, who somehow have been also accused of incitement and plotting against the state. This lack of genuine multi-party democracy in Cambodia is sadly only one of the shortcomings of the royal government of Cambodia with respect to the agreement. However, the fundamental freedom per the agreement are enshrined in the Cambodian constitution as well, seem to exist only by theory or on paper. The civic space have been consistently strung by the repressive and restricted law that the government have adopted to legitimize their crackdown on civic space. Countless individuals, journalists, human rights defenders, activists, and members of political opposition and honorary citizens have been targeted because of their criticism against the government policy. Although you may have noticed recently the government have released a number of young activists that have been arrested in the mid last year. These young activists, simply they exercise their fundamental freedom, and caring of environment or caring of, civic space is not a crime. But they were put in jail. They have been convicted because they exercise their freedom to assembly or freedom of expression. Regardless their release, you could see they were put under the judicial supervision, lengthy judicial supervision, ranging from 2 years to 3 years under judicial supervision. So it leaves them in a limbo where the government can target them anytime if they would do anything critical against the government. And these young activists still commit to continue to engage in this civic space. So we will see how long this the release can guarantee them certain level of freedom. I would also highlight it that beyond this series of crackdown against democratic actors, the government keep introducing a number of legislation in the coming year. Not only the LANGO, the Law on Association and NGO law, the trade union law, but the government plan to come up with the cybercrime law. Before cybercrime law, the government already adopted the National Internet Gateway that give a lot of controlling power for the government to control the internet infrastructure. And in coming year, next year and following year, Cambodia is preparing the Commune Council election and national election in 2023. Yeah, so to what extent this free and fair election would be guaranteed as outlined in the Paris Peace Agreement as well as in our constitution is maybe it's not hardly predict if this current civic space is continue to be under attack. Therefore, I believe that the signatory party to the agreement have the responsibility toward Cambodian people and owe it to them to take the role as the guardian of Cambodian democracy and human rights seriously, and the remain scope of more action from the signatory country to lie up to their obligation under agreement and to keep the government accountable for its failure and shortcoming in upholding the agreement. So on the 30th anniversary of agreement and in respect of Human Rights Day as well, while we rightly commemorate all this occasion, I think let us not forget about the road that still lie ahead. A genuine and unwavering commitment to the vision of the agreement that a peaceful and democratic Cambodia is needed from all, now more than ever, to put Cambodia back to the agreement path and finally make their vision a reality. So I thank to all the support from the international community, especially the signatory that invest their effort in the past 30 years ago, but I recall that the signatory continue to renew this effort to help to uphold the government in this democratic path, and we thank for your attention and continuing journey together. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sopheap. It was very, very insightful on the achievement and challenges of the Paris Agreement. One of the questions from Sopheap is how the fair election can be guaranteed in Cambodia under Paris Peace Agreement. Now we have a third speaker, who is Mr. Karel Jiaan Antonio Galang, Program Officer from Asia Democracy Network, who has been working a lot on election as well as observing Cambodia. Mr. Karel, you have 15 minutes.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency Yuyun. Greetings, everyone in the region and all over the world. I am Karel, as Ms. Yuyun said, of the Asia Democracy Network. So for the year 2022, Cambodia will hold the position of the ASEAN Chair. And this has implications for the state of democracy in the region. No? Just this December 7, Myanmar's Tatmadaw appointed Foreign Minister Wonalong Win met with the Cambodian Prime Minister Samdech Hun Sen in Phnom Penh to discuss the country's bilateral relations. The visit comes amid the dire situation in Myanmar, with thousands of lives claimed by the Tatmadaw's crackdown on pro-democracy protests after the February 2021 coup. And the arrest and detention of leaders like NLD, the rightful holders of the electoral mandate, the takeover of institutions such as the media, and the continuous harassment of pro-democracy leaders and takeover of institutions. But such warm relationship between the two Southeast Asian actors is not surprising. In fact, Cambodians are quite too familiar with the situation in Myanmar, as Prime Minister Hun Sen himself has essentially used the very same repressive tactics to take control of the country for almost 4 decades. With the warm relationship between the two kindred spirits, we can expect that a solid regional response on Myanmar will be in peril. It is no surprise that Hun Sen and the Tatmadaw would enjoy that brotherly familiar relationship. Let us remember that Prime Minister Hun Sen also comes from a military background. In fact, prior to becoming the Prime Minister of Cambodia, he fought for the Khmer Rouge as a battalion commander during the Cambodian Civil War, before defecting at a convenient time. He has an undeniable skill in terms of evading and manipulating justice mechanisms, despite the atrocities that he committed. And this is the primary reason why the resolution of the great humanitarian democracy tragedy that is Cambodia remains to be elusive. It is because at the helm and the peak of the Cambodian political power is a crafty man who has the power to warp justice and political mechanisms to his own benefit. As a result, 30 years after the 1991 Paris Peace Accords, we find Cambodia to be in the same dire humanitarian situation. The aims of the Paris Peace Accords, viewed as the foundation of peace, democracy, and human rights in Cambodia, remains to be unfulfilled. And in fact, in the eyes of Prime Minister Hun Sen himself and the CCP he leads, the Paris Peace Accord or the agreement is like a ghost, quote unquote. Indeed, it is as dead as a ghost, with Hun Sen and CCP being the murderers of Cambodia's chance for real democracy. Let us look at the most recent injuries Cambodia has received from Hun Sen. And by identifying these, I make the case that the situation in Cambodia should be viewed in the same light as the world views Myanmar and other countries devastated by autocracies. And that the international community must see these as priorities, the international that must have pressure on. So the first stab and the deadliest stab that Cambodia received from Prime Minister Hun Sen is that Hun Sen has essentially made it impossible for real elections and other political processes to reflect the will of the people. Let us remember that in the 2018 National Assembly elections, the CCP, quote-unquote, CPP quote-unquote won all the 125 seats in the National Assembly, which was not surprising given that CPP's strongest opposition, CNRP, was dissolved, eliminating any real challenge. And its leaders either were incarcerated or forced into exile. Furthermore, one can expect impartiality given that the whole National Election Committee is a captured management body and is composed of members selected by CPP and its cohorts. As an election observer, I have always described Cambodian elections to be a model, not because it is a good election conductor, but it is a model on how not to conduct elections. And despite these flaws, we still saw countries such as China, the Philippines, Laos, Thailand congratulate CPP on its in its win. No, let us keep in mind that the situation remains the same, and nothing will change despite the 22 and 23 elections fast approaching. The second stab, attack the independent media. The Cambodian government sees Cambodia as among the best countries for media, but let me qualify that it only applies for government media and the propaganda channels that it has. The country remains to be among the most dangerous spaces for independent media, with journalists risking arrests for asking the wrong questions, harassment for reporting on questionable actions by the government, or closure for an entire media company for simply doing its job of being independent. Let us remember the names of brave journalists, such as Ross Soket, Sok Udom, Ratmoni, and Sovariti, who have faced persecutions for merely doing their job. Let us remember that independent media companies, such as the now closed Cambodia Daily and the Phnom Penh Post, were victimized by this crusade against truth-telling by the Hun Sen government. Third stab, continuously persecute human rights and democracy in organizations. The Cambodian government has used a variety of tools to suppress civil society, from the use of harsh lingo and abusive taxation laws, to accusations of fomenting color revolutions, to outright harassment, assassination, and surveillance of actors, which makes it hard for them to unite nationally and with the regional community. This combination of actions have made it difficult for institutions which advocate for justice and accountability to thrive. Now, with the emergence of government-organized non-governmental organizations, and with the support of illiberal actors in the region, the remaining space for Cambodian civil society remains to shrink day by day. This persecution of democracy actors are among the main reasons why EU CBA deal with Cambodia fell apart. As long as great illiberal actors such as China are providing economic and diplomatic shield for Cambodia, human rights situation in the country will only continue to deteriorate. So finally, as my last point, what should the international community do? And the most important thing I think is be visible and talk with the Cambodians themselves. Everybody is talking with Hun Sen and with the Cambodian government, but not a lot are seen talking to the Cambodians themselves. The remaining civil society in the country needs support. Help them through capacity building and funding to create pockets of resistance against the Cambodian government and the regime of Hun Sen. In fact, ADN conducted a discussion on the Paris Peace Accords in Phnom Penh during its 25-year anniversary, and not much has changed since then in terms of democracy. So we challenge those international actors and intergovernmental institutions which ushered the adoption of the PPA to revive it, to go against Hun Sen's pronouncements that it is dead, as it only reflects their effectiveness as international actors. Despite these, the international actors within the ADN network will continue to support the threatened civil society and media to have space in regional advocacy, and everyone must do so. Much resources and capacity building support, especially legal, physical, and digital security, needs to be given to them to consolidate nationally and with their regional counterparts. We call on international institutions such as the ASEAN and Yuyun to provide them with the opportunity to raise their voice and present their situation. And finally, treat Cambodians' democracy situation in the same urgency as Myanmar. Everyone is threatened. Everyone's experiencing the same dire situation. So thank you very much. And I hope to participate further in the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Karel. It's very good to be reminded on the situation, especially in this December, toward the next year, what we are going to expect for Cambodia as a chair of ASEAN. You provided a very gray picture, which is, I hope, helpful for us to reflect on what to plan, what to do to help Cambodians and democracy in Cambodia. Now I would like to open for question and answers. But prior to that, may I ask everyone to put on your camera so we can have a group picture before we end our panel, our discussion, just to make sure that we get everyone. Wait, I can make, okay. I can do screenshot from here. Can we ask those who are comfortable to show your camera, please do, so we can document this moment for documentation, of course. All right, on 3, 1, 1, 2, 3. Smile. Oh, someone entering the room. Oh, once more. Okay. 1, 2, 3. Smile. All right. Now we can have our question and answer session. If you want to ask the question clarification directly, please raise your hand so the organizer can unmute you. Sue.
Yes.
Sue, okay, please.
Thank you. Thank you for such a very interesting seminar. I've really enjoyed all the speakers very much indeed. I had some questions, particularly for Chak Sopie. Chak, it's lovely to see you, and I do hope all is well with you there. I'm hoping to see you in person soon. I just have a few questions. Do you think that it's at all possible to get the Paris Peace Agreement participants together again? What's your view on that? Because I know many Cambodians do feel that that's something that they would like to see happen. And what do you think it would achieve? How would the UN have to manage that? And what notice would Hun Sen take of it?
Okay, thank you very much. Can I collect another question so the speakers will be able to answer those questions together? Can I see more hands?
I've got about 3 questions for Sopheap.
Oh,
so
yes.
Keep going if you like. The second one is the elections are coming up, commune and the main elections. Are there serious contenders? And how will they assert their position? And how will the government respond? This is difficult to answer, I know, but I would be very interested to hear that. And apart from that, I wonder, how are the teachings of the Paris Peace Agreement to go forward with young Cambodians? And does the greatest hope, I know Gareth believes it does, and I think we probably all do, does it lie with Cambodians in the future? How can this be taken forward? What can happen to ensure that young Cambodians can in fact reach a future that we would all like to see them come to?
Thank you. So Pete, you want to answer the 3 questions? I also would like to invite Mr. Evans and Karel to respond to the questions. So Pete, please.
Sure. Thank you, Sue, and nice to see you again here virtually. Indeed, yeah, I would be much happier to meet in person, but
I know. Let's hope we do.
Yeah, but thanks for your question. Indeed, is quite challenging question to answer, but I try my best. As you could see, a number of civil society actors have repeatedly our message that, you know, the signatory should have a role to play, you know, because when we look at the Paris Peace Agreement, indeed, it's not just the obligation of Cambodian government alone. Cambodia is one of the signatory, but the rest other also have the role to play. But of course, I understand, you know, like with the core interest within the Paris Peace Agreement itself is Cambodia. So Cambodia should walk on our path. But we know that Cambodian government have derailed from that path. So how should we do? So for us, we believe that other signatory still owe us the obligation to make sure that, you know, the Cambodian government respect this agreement. But to be realistic. We can't be living in just idealism, but to be realistic. Of course, we can see how dynamic have changed within all of the signatory. Not all are active, democratic states. We can't expect Vietnam or Indonesia, perhaps other, country in the region that share a similar kind of trend, or they somehow like to co-op together, in the authoritarian region. So personally, I don't have high expectation that they all come together, but and in the form like they did in the past 30 years ago. But what I believe, this the caring state, the caring signatory could do something, and that's what I believe some of them have been doing, but more just a kind of symbolic, like trying to host the panel discussion, or try to recognize that Paris Peace Agreement is still a valuable document to look up to, because the Cambodian government keeps saying that, well, Paris Agreement is no longer valid. It's that document. But I think with the significant role of a number of signatories who come up and say, well, the Paris Peace Agreement still become a foundation where Cambodians should look up and work toward that part. I think that also valuable. So again, to answer your question is that I don't have high hope, but I still expect that some of signatory will do something, and even it may not in the framework of Paris Peace Agreement, but I believe that they come with a respective bilateral relationship. For example, some like look at the European Commission, they use the framework of EBA, or US, they use the framework of, their other possible action, like targeted sanction, for example. So yeah, to me, I think respective signatory will do something in the framework of human rights, and that human rights principle have been coded in the Paris Peace Agreement. Your second question on the election, yes, as I said, election is coming soon, and next year, Cambodia in the role as the ASEAN Chair as well will be very kind of interesting. I think perhaps the role as the ASEAN Chair may have certain effect as well, because more or less Cambodian government like to be recognized at the international stage. So maybe they would do something, not in the respect that I expect for a genuine election, but they may do something, more careful. But like commune council election have been always a parameter of ruling party to test how people support their work. So like last commune council election, we could see that the process have been somehow smooth, and we as civil society somehow recognize and appreciate the election process during the election, during the commune council election. Never ever that we have that kind of sense. And if Cambodia could just follow the same step, maybe somehow we can appreciate that at least somehow we have been trying to work toward the more genuine election. But the problem those with the political challenges up to this point, CNOP have been dissolved, but even within the CNOP themselves, they have been kind of splitting. We are not sure even in the ruling party equally, they have certain internal problem too. But I just hope that we as civil society and people can watch out and try to push for a more policy debate, not an individual attack like we experienced in the past election mandate. So to me, I'm not just looking at the politicians themselves or political party themselves, but I think we have to turn back to ourselves as a citizen. What can we push for? And we should not let the political party or politician to decide, but it is people who can decide in the process. And final question on the how we take our young generation on Paris Peace Agreement or the spirit of Constitution. Well, yes, I think this is something we as civil society try to do on a daily basis. Even we don't say that we don't use the Paris Peace Agreement and teach people directly, but we empower the community with the principle of human rights. And I believe that we take that spirit from the Paris Peace Agreement, because a lot of human rights principle or the foundation of democracy have been outlined clearly in the Paris Peace Agreement, and it has been kind of integrated well in the Constitution, although not everything, but yeah, the value in our Constitution there, and the young people are somehow they exercise their fundamental freedom. So to me, it's not just about a linear approach, like, okay, here the Paris Peace Agreement, no, but here, you know, it is the fundamental freedom that we all are entitled to. And this is the message that we keep sending and train the community and support the community to claim their right on a daily basis. I hope I answered to your question.
And you absolutely did. And I'm sorry I've taken so much time, but they're very important questions and answers. Thank you very much, Sopheap. And I hope to see you soon. Thank you.
Sopheap, Karel or Mr. Evans, do you want to add into the conversation, please? Karel? Karel? No?
Well,
Sorry, not for now.
Okay.
Well, I think Sopheap has said it all very well indeed. The important thing about the Paris peace agreements is that they're probably not realistic as a vehicle for reconvening and formally reimposing their authority, but they do have a great moral authority, and Sopheap made that point. They do set the standards, which were supposed to be and largely were embodied in the Cambodian constitution, but have been largely ignored, of course, by Hun Sen ever since. But they remain a beacon and they remain a reference point, not only for the international community and individual countries who I hope would recognize their responsibilities to put the pressure that they're capable of doing on the regime, but they're also a source of inspiration and authority and reference for internal purposes, for campaign purposes, for educating the next generation in the way that Sopheap and so many of the other human rights defenders are doing, and just as a vehicle for continuing to give inspiration and hope that things will change. The elections are going to be very, very tough in the present environment unless a whole bunch of countries like Australia exercise the power that we have, the pressure capability that we have with sanctions, and really make life difficult for a lot of those people in and around Hun Sen. And even that, we have to be, I guess, pessimistic. And it may be realistically that real political change in Cambodia is going to have to wait until Hun Sen finally runs out of puff, because there's every chance that the ruling regime will disintegrate with his departure, because there's obviously internal pressures and a lot of the people whose personal ambitions would be thwarted if Hun Sen's son were to take over and establish a dynastic regime. They're going to be unhappy about that. And we've seen this happen quite often with authoritarian regimes in the past. At times of transition, they're at their most vulnerable. So it's absolutely critical that the forces of opposition, you know, be prepared for that, and just to continue to work away and have credible programs and credible capacity for mobilization. A final point about external support for organizations inside Cambodia that are pressing for human rights. We externally have to be quite careful and sensitive about the way in which we handle that support. I mean, financial support is obviously extremely helpful to keep these organizations going, but that can create a lot of difficulties with governing regimes if this, becomes known, they become subject to pressure, and it can be very difficult. So what we have to do externally is take our cue from what people inside, the leaders inside Cambodia, the resistance leaders, the opposition voices are telling us, and not think that we know better than the Cambodian people themselves. So they're simply my thoughts on what Sopheap has really expressed very well indeed.
Thank you.
Can I ask you a question, Yuyun? I
Me?
challenged you during my remarks to tell us, as the Indonesian representative on the Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, what the hell this can do in an ASEAN context to genuinely uphold supposed ASEAN-wide human rights standards. Is there anything you can do, or are you reduced to frustrated impotence on the sidelines?
If I'm outside of the system, yes, I will say that I'm frustrated, but it is my responsibility to be optimistic when I'm inside the system. So in relation to responding to human rights situation, what I've been hearing this morning from all of you is really something that I really appreciate. It gives me a lot of preparation for the next year if I'm going to be the Chair representative from Indonesia 2022-2024, because this year is my last year in this term. And but at the same time, ASEAN and Chair have limitations that we have to deal with. The limitation in the last 3 years, Chair has been able to develop its internal mechanism to comment, question member states on their human rights situation. It was triggered by the situation in Myanmar. So inside Chair, we have regular agenda. We call it recent development of human rights in ASEAN. So we able to present our situation in the country, as well as to question situation of human rights in other countries. So we have started in April, June, and November. And the opportunity between Chair to meet with the ASEAN foreign ministers was also used to highlight the issues of Myanmar, particularly Myanmar, because that's something that we discuss a lot, and there has been a consensus on the situation in Myanmar in relation to humanitarian, politic, and as well as human rights. So we gradually address this limitation of mechanism. This year, we also managed to establish some kind of mini UPR system. We call it ASEAN Human Rights Dialogue, which each member states able to present their situation of human rights, and we can question and then receive answers. So this is not the first time that ASEAN organized this, initiated by Chair. In 2013, Indonesia initiated this activity. It was only Indonesia presented human rights situation, but now 8 out of 10 countries presented their human rights situation. So we wanted to copy the system in UPR, but it is rather mini. But we have not been able to reach at the point that to adopt the recommendation. In the last ASEAN Human Rights Dialogue on 21st of September, Cambodian government did not give the briefing. I think there was a dualism on human rights foreign policy, I believe. Human rights presentation in ASEAN as well as in the UN was arranged under the office of the Prime Minister, but the foreign ministry of Cambodia did responsible on something else. So the one who come to our ASEAN Human Rights Dialogue coming from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Cambodia, but the affairs related to human rights in ASEAN as well as in UN is actually responsibility of the Prime Minister office. So there is a gap of information, gap of coordination. Well, I'm not in the position to actually to explain this, because this is something that I gathered. But in the meeting among some senior official meeting in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Cambodia has agreed to co-organize ASEAN Human Rights Dialogue next year together with Indonesia. So this is another, this is an opportunity to highlight the issues on human rights and in Cambodia, of course, and that is why I think what I have been hearing now is adding to what I have been monitoring so far on the situation in Cambodia. So that's from so that's how we deal with some challenges and limitation of mechanism in ICHR. Now we have complaint mechanism as well, adopted in November 2019. But this complaint mechanism is not yet fully function, in the sense of this is a three-step complaint mechanism. It means now ICHR has accepted to receive complaints, but on country in question will be the one to address the problem. And this is not safe for me, because the country in question will seek for those who are reporting their country and arrest them. So that is why we have a mixed feeling of promoting this mechanism. Yes, it is now openness in ICHR, but we worried the implication to human rights defenders or organization if they submitted human rights complaints. But in agenda, in regular meeting of ICHR, I often address the issues. In the last 3 meetings, I addressed the issue of Myanmar a lot, on refugees, the right to health for prisoners, the sexual violation on rape committed by security forces against ethnic Myanmarese, and the rest of the human rights defenders, and so on and so forth. And it created discussion in ASEAN, in ICHR, and it created a response from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Myanmar, who attended the Foreign Ministers meeting. So we look forward to expand further mandate in ICHR to be able to address issues in Cambodia as well. Yeah, so that's so far what we have been addressing in ICHR.
Well, thank you, Yuyun. I mean, that's a very challenging environment that you're confronting, but you persuaded me that at least something is happening, and it's good to hear the Indonesian voice being articulated. I think the reality, as we all know, in ASEAN, nothing really happens ever that's difficult unless Indonesia takes the responsibility for making it happen. And I hope that your voice, your optimistic voice, will continue to be heard as you continue this effort, both with Myanmar, of course, but also with Cambodia, which simply must not be forgotten. With all the focus on Myanmar being as it is, nonetheless, the situation in Cambodia really is pretty disgraceful, and it's very important that that regional voice be heard. So I'm sorry to interrupt you. You go back to being a moderator now.
Okay. So we have 2 participants raise hand, but I would like to recognize the comments from Wakansila. What happened to Cambodia can happen in the Pacific or Fiji if the informal nation builder are not protected or empowered with sustainability action. And also there is a question from Fazar Ula. How do you see the current situation of partnership between Australian and Cambodian civil societies, and how it can be strengthened? Can we keep this question, and then I would like to invite those who raised hand earlier. Who raised hand? Sorry, cannot see now. Seray Sam and Ko Solman. Can you want to ask question directly, please? We can put you.
I think Mr. Seray Sam's hands up first, I think.
Oh, okay.
I'll
okay.
do second. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just want to put comment on what the previous speaker, that is brilliant, fantastic event today. Thank you very much for the ASEAN Democracy Network for having this opportunity to raise about the Paris Peace Agreement and about Cambodia. Really appreciate that. And actually, Cambodia is in a political crisis due to the violation of the Paris Peace Agreement. And in this day, it's a good day also for like the President Biden, United States, who hold the Summit for Democracy to encourage and to promote human rights around the world. So I hope that the political crisis in Cambodia will be solved if the signatory country of Paris Peace Agreement and United Nations take actions to press against the regime to respect the Paris Peace Agreement, because they violate the Paris Peace Agreement since 1979. The Hun Sen, they make a coup to take the power. And since then, no one has been said about this. But for me, as a president for the Khmer National Liberation Front that located in Denmark, I advocate for the respect of the Paris Peace Agreement. So in this opportunity, I would like to thank all of you and all the international community, especially European Union, United States, Australia, who pay attention on the human rights situation in Cambodia and democracy in Cambodia. And I hope that all the signatory country will bring all political party to have to solve the political crisis. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Ko Solman, please.
Thank you, Your Excellency. My question is directly to Mr. Gareth even. My name is Ko Solman. I'm from Burma, the 1988 student. I came to Australia while Mr. Gareth even was the foreign minister. So thank you. And my question is, the Australia as a government sitting in Southeast Asia region, that Australia involvement in peacekeeping, especially for Cambodia, Paris Peace Agreement. But what do you think, so how do you compare with Cambodia and Myanmar? Because Cambodia atrocities was a very short amount of time, so many lives, and the media, the world media see that that's a big issue. But in the same time, when you look at the Myanmar issue since 1962, there's so many lives being, just lost. And even just current situation, as everybody's know, how Australia stand that peacekeeping, how to say, involvement for Myanmar issue for as a Australia.
Well,
Okay, so we have two questions. Partnership between Australian and Cambodian civil society and how it can be strengthened, and the comparison between a situation in Cambodia and Myanmar as of now. Mr. Evans, do you want to respond to these two questions?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so far as Cambodian and Australian civil society organizations, there is quite a deal of cooperation, I know, between a number of diaspora organizations within Australia that are very actively involved, some of them with the opposition political party, others just more generally in sort of agitating for focus, attention, change with the Australian government, and that's very helpful. How much direct contact there is with the civil society organizations like Chak, Sopheap, I'm not sure, and I would welcome Sopheap's answer to that particular question of what her understanding is of the extent of that cooperation and what she would like to see changed in that respect. It may be that Sue Coffey, who has been following these issues very, very closely, might have also something to say on that question of civil society cooperation and coordination. As to, and I appreciate what Sanderson said and about the importance of keeping alive the flame of the Paris conference as a standard bearer, even if there are difficulties in re-establishing it. But as to Co-Salzman's question, yes, there are obvious parallels between Cambodia and Myanmar in terms of the suffering that's existed within the country, sometimes reaching genocidal proportions, as it obviously did under the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, but also with the Rohingya people. Let's forget the scale of the suffering that was caused there and continues to be experienced by all those displaced Rohingya people now in Bangladesh. But the civil war, which is now becoming a civil war, let's face it, it's not just repression, it's not just dissidents, it's now active fighting going on with a number of the militia groups and a number of people now going from the cities to join them, and a campaign of sabotage and significant, albeit sporadic, violence taking place. So we are looking at an emerging civil war situation, and which does, of course, have parallels with civil war situation which existed in Cambodia at the time of the peace conference. What we don't have in Myanmar is any obvious process to move the thing forward. That was the case for a very long time with Cambodia. Because there was internal divisions, because there was divisions in the region, because there were divisions within the major powers as to who they were supporting. It did look very intractable, just as the Myanmar situation looks intractable now. I did have a formula which worked in Cambodia because I made the judgment, as a number of people had, that the only way you're going to move that game forward was to somehow stop China supporting the Khmer Rouge. And for that to happen, we're going to have to find a face-saving formula, and the face-saving formula that stuck out to me then, and which did ultimately prevail, was this absolutely central role for the United Nations, as I said in my remarks. There's no obvious formula that's going to solve the Myanmar problem other than the recognition, by the military that has gone too far, that the country has become completely ungovernable, the economy is in free fall, and that it doesn't really have a lot of international support. The Indians are getting fed up with it because of the implications for the situation in the Indian Northeast. China is, as usual, playing a game of being wholly concerned with its own interests, and but that has not made it entirely supportive of the Tatmadaw. I mean, the Chinese want to play both sides of the fence, keep their lines open with the NLD, but there's no obvious cutting-edge formula that will solve this, other than pressure on the military to realize that it's in a dead end, and for international support to still be given to the opposition forces. I mean, part of the problem, I don't know what your position on this was, Mr. Salzman, but part of the problem was the love affair that the international community had with Aung San Suu Kyi, which was not followed with any serious responsibility by Suu Kyi in the way in which she played the very influential role that she did. I'm not blaming her, obviously, for the military coup, which is totally indefensible and has its own separate dynamic. But we did not get, during that period of huge international support, and when the military had stepped back, we didn't get that really passionate commitment to democratizing the country, the development of institutions, bringing along the next generation of leaders. And and we, of course, in the case of Suu Kyi, we had no love at all for the Rohingya people. So there was no unanimity, as there is now under the opposition government, would-be government. There's no unity of response. So it's a difficult, but there are parallels. Whether Australia would be prepared again to send peacekeepers, should there be some kind of international agreement reached under UN auspices? Yeah, I think we would be very open to doing that. Many other countries would, just as Australia has been active in the region very recently in sending peacekeepers again into the Solomons to help, stabilize the situation there. And in that context, I acknowledge the question that was asked earlier on, or the comment that was made earlier on about Fiji. If you do ignore these authoritarian currents that are developing within countries, when you have a chance to suppress them, it's just not helpful to the long-term future of those countries. And we have many examples in our own region. So it's just a very difficult situation at the moment in Myanmar as it is in Cambodia. There's a lot more international attention being focused on Myanmar at the moment, which was helpful. And I think one of our aspirations with this seminar and all the many people from around the world who are involved in it, our focus must be on keeping the flame of international attention alight when it comes to Cambodia, and not just letting people feel a sense of hopelessness that nothing much is going to change. It's really quite serious, the violations that continue to occur in Cambodia, and very serious for the future of the country, as the future of the people. And it is important that we put the pressure on. But no instant coffee solutions, I'm afraid. But that's what international diplomacy is so often about. You just have to keep on grinding away.
Sopheap, you want to respond on the partnership between Australia and Cambodia civil society and how to strengthen it?
Sure. Thank you, Yuyun and Professor, for giving me the chance to answer this question. I think it's a good question, and I keep highlighting somehow in my last session on the Paris Peace Agreement that hosted by the Australian Embassy. I have highlighted how the partnership between the Australian and Cambodian civil society during my talk too, and I would like to repeat here that while I could see the effort from the Australian government 30 years ago through the Professor Gareth as the foreign minister with the Paris Peace Agreement, and up to this point where the Australian support the the democratic but also the development cooperation through the we call T2T government to government partnership. But for me, I value a lot of the support extended from the Australian community. I mean P2P, the people to people relationship here, because I have a chance last few years to visit Australia, as part of my mission supported by the Australian Embassy. But the beauty of the interaction with a number of community, with the academia, with the CSO or honorary citizen like Sue, I call her as honorary citizen, but she's a very vocal, as an author, but to her it's more kind of friend to friend. So I have interacted a lot with other community across the world, extend support, but the level that I have interacted with the Australian community during my interaction both in Australia and in Cambodia is that I got the message of support saying that, look, Sopie, what do you really need for us to do this or do that? And then it's not just about saying it out, but they really make it. I mean, the feeling that I got that, for example, we can talk to the parliamentarian, we can talk to this NGO or INGO to walk that talk, for example, and I sense how they take it seriously. Compare my feeling meeting with other community elsewhere. I feel yes, they say that they are standing with us. They send the solidarity, but I feel the message from Australian community are more clearer. And I'm sorry, it's not undermine other interaction, but I want to speak true from my heart that, you know, I got that message. And so I want to appreciate and thank to the Australian people that I have interact with, and or maybe I'm not yet interact, but they have do a lot of things as the citizen, you know, not just because they are mandated to do as a government official or anywhere, but they do care. So I think it is very valuable already, and I just encourage that this valuable partnership are continue, you know, from the people to people relationship, and this people to people relationship can strengthen further, you know, between the people to government or government to people, between the Australian and Cambodian people here, on the fact that, you know, like there are certain things that come into trouble in our how to say the Australian interaction with the Cambodian bilateral relationship. For example, when it comes to the migration issue, you know, we may recall last few years when the issue of sending the you know, the refugee, yeah, to Cambodia, we question a lot why Cambodia, why, you know, with the human rights abuse. But now, you know, with the Australian active role to support the establishment of the NXRI, the National Human Rights Institution, we also question on, you know, like what Australian government expect. We as civil society organization, we have made our position clear in our joint statement, saying that we don't believe the NXRI will be established independently in the current context. Not the fact, not that we don't want it, we want it, but I think that message have not been heard much, have not been listened to. So my request to Australian community, yeah, I mean, you can extend your support further to send the message to the Australian government. Look, you know, what really Cambodian people want when it comes to the NXRI. So thank you. I hope I answered to that question.
Thank you. We don't have enough time anymore, but let me recognize a question from Vesna Apeda, Cambodia, on the importance of looking at labor rights as an area of engagement, both multilateral and bilateral trade agreements. The existing of labor activists is just one factor as well. I think that's comments, and I think that's inputs to not to overlook the importance of labor rights. Karel, actually, I want to ask you a question, since Sopie also mentioned about NHRI. I was invited to to give inputs on the establishment of NHRI by the government of Cambodia a couple months ago. How do you see, as at the end, how do you see this the establishment of a national human institution in Cambodia? Would this help the situation, as you mentioned earlier, that Cambodia is a model of not to conduct election? Cambodia is the worst place for journalists, prosecutors of human rights journalists. So I take a note of your presentation. So this is perspective from a person who observes Cambodian issue, working on election, but you are outsider of Cambodia. Because some people already mentioned about the inside perspective, and now I would like to hear the outsiders. Please.
I mean, yeah, from an outsider's perspective, I think movements like this or demands like this on establishing institutions that protect human rights, the prime actors that should be consulted are the people themselves. And it should be driven from the grassroots. So as a democracy actor, if institutions would just only talk to the Cambodian government on this aspect, I think this has no legitimacy. You know, I think that it is like a hollow block of wood being asked to support a ton of problems within the country. You know, so I think in doing so, if governments really want to support the establishment of human rights mechanisms within the country, they should also empower civil society to be represented in such an important decision-making process or institution building process. So I call on your office as well as international actors to please hear first the civil society on this aspect. No, it is true. I am not withholding that. I see the dire situation in Cambodia as very grave, and in fact that as a Filipino working on this field, I only feel sympathy and solidarity with our Cambodian colleagues, because we know how they experience this. No, we have been through a lot of political upheavals already, and they are still continuing to do so at present. So I wish that the international community can only support what they really want to do. No.
Thank you, Karel. Oh, Sue, you want to say something?
I just wanted to make a quick comment. I'm very disappointed, and many people are, that the Australian government is almost alone is supporting this new proposed human rights organisation. And I've actually made representations to the Australian Parliament through the Human Rights Committee that this should not happen. No CSO or NGO of substance is actually supporting this proposal, and it's very hard to understand why Australia is involved, and it's quite grievous, I think. I also, just quickly to add to what Sopheap said about relationships with diasporas and Cambodians in Australia and other countries. I am in Australia, and I work with Likardo in Cambodia, and one of the things that is there is a great diaspora in Australia. There is a serious problem with intimidation by members of the CPP coming to Australia to intimidate members, younger members of the diaspora. But one thing that's really, really needed is money, frankly. I mean, human rights organisations can't run on nothing. So I spend a good deal of my time approaching high net worth individuals, and it is, I simply make the point that it is very hard to raise money for human rights. It is scary for many people. So while I've been successful in raising gifts in kind, it is really the Scandinavians, the Europeans and the Americans who are much better at philanthropy than Australia, but it's very much needed. I'll just throw those thoughts in there.
Thank you. So for that note, I would like to end the session. It has been very rich discussion. I learned a lot, and I hope all the participants here learn a lot from the views of Mr. Gareth Evans, Sopheap, Chak, as well as Karel, Galang, and also all the participants' views. And thank you very much for the participation. Before closing, I would like to ask Patrick or from DTP to give a closing remark, please.
Thank you very much, Yuyun. It's really been an honor to be able to host this seminar for the diplomacy training program. And so let me begin by thanking all of the people who participated, who joined us for this discussion today. But in particular, thanks, of course, to our speakers, I think, who've both been moving and inspiring, which is so important. They've challenged us, and they've provoked our thinking about what can be done going forward, while reflecting on the history in the past of how we got to where we are now. And I think that's incredibly significant. Human rights is both very much about the law, but it's also about history. And I think we're reminded of that in today's discussion. Thank you to you, Yuyun, for your moderation today, but also your advocacy over very many years and in many different roles, and particularly now with AICHA and the way that you have been seeking to develop the role that AICHA can play within ASEAN in the promotion and protection of human rights. It's really very inspiring, and we applaud you in those efforts, and we thank you for making the time today and for helping us to keep human rights in Cambodia on the agenda. I think it's a very important day. Reminded it's the International Day for the Prevention of Genocide. We have to learn the lessons from what happened in Cambodia, as the architects of the drafters of the Paris Peace Agreements did, I think, very much drawing in a way from the UN Charter and the relationship between peace, human rights and development. It's incredibly significant that we reflect also on this day in relation to another country in Myanmar, another country in ASEAN, Myanmar. And I think we've heard very powerfully from our partners in the Asia Democracy Network and in relation to the backward steps we're seeing on democracy across the region, the shrinking space for civil society and the way that challenges us all. Sopheap, thank you for reminding us this is also the International Day of Human Rights Defenders, and that tomorrow we mark International Human Rights Day, December the 10th. So it's a very good time for us to have come together, to have reflected, I think, to share some knowledge and experience, and to consider how do we keep building our movements for human rights. And I think Gareth Evans has reminded us just of how important those movements are, that the hopes for human rights really rest in the work that you do, Sopie, work that you do, Karel, in the work that you're doing, Yuyun, and others here who joined us today. So thank you very much. Please take care, stay safe. The Diplomacy Training Programme looks forward to engaging with you, to taking forward the work. You've challenged us to think about what we can do in relation to supporting the human rights movements in Cambodia, and we'll take away from this a renewed determination to do that, to work with our alumni there, our partners there. And we really are very much inspired by your courage. Please take care. Go well.